It's time to get started with a Wednesday night Bible study. I guess added to the prayer list, Marilyn Leary is recovering from COVID down at the Meadows, and in the online version of the announcement sheet, it had her telephone number and address, and I think it's on the bulletin board as well. And I believe her son asked for us to send her some cards and call her. Let's see. Again on February 16th, Galentine's night. It's in the annex. And what time is that? 6. It's $12 a person, due by Sunday, February the 12th. And February 20th through the 22nd is a gospel meeting at Amory Congregation, 7 o'clock each night, meal each night at 5:30. And we're having a first responders breakfast here in the annex at 7 a.m. on February 25th. And we're cooking, I take it, for them. Fulton Bible Institute at 7 on Tuesday nights, and 21st Global Missions leaves it Thursday at 10. That's all I have. And Jim will be leading the singing. Johnny Tucker's got the scripture reading, and Doug has the prayer, and Matt's got the devotion.
Scripture reading tonight will be taken from Numbers chapter 16. Numbers chapter 16, verses 12 through 15. And Moses sent to call Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, but they said, "We will not come up. Is it a small thing that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey, to kill us in the wilderness, that you should keep acting like a prince over us? Moreover, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, nor given us inheritance of fields and vineyards. Will you put out the eyes of these men? We will not come up." Then Moses was very angry and said to the Lord, "Do not respect their offering. I have not taken one donkey from them, nor have I hurt one of them."
If you would get your books, Mark 197. 197 is our song of invitation tonight. Tonight for devotional thought, I want to go with the passage Johnny just read for us as we continue our study through the book of Numbers. And as I was reading this today, this verse jumped out at me because of what the Israelites say. You'll remember this is right after the spies have went out, and they have rejected the spies, and they're cursed to wander in the wilderness. And during this time, you have 3 men who come up and lead an insurrection. They lead a rebellion against Moses. One is Dathan, one is Abiram, and the other is Kohath. Korah. Oh, his name just slipped me. Anyway, the third guy, that's a Levite. We'll talk about him when we get to class. He will be the one, Korah. I knew it was there, verse 8. Korah is there. But these 2 men, Dathan and Abiram, come to Moses, and they question Moses' leadership. And what we see in verse 12 is Moses calls them to come to him to give a report, to answer for this rebellion. And what we see in these verses is a very interesting thing. But notice that the first thing in verse 12, they say, "We will not come up." Moses is their leader. This would be about like us today, getting a summons to go to the mayor or go to the governor or go to the president. our leader, and he says, I want to have a meeting with you. We need to talk. And us say, I'm not coming. I'm not listening to you. Total disrespect. And this is what they're doing. They're trying to undermine Moses. But what really struck me as odd is the next verse, where they say in verse 13, is it a small thing that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey, to kill us in this wilderness, that you must also make yourself a prince over us? Moreover, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, nor given us inheritance of fields and vineyards. Will you put out the eyes of these men? Will you not come up? Or we will not come up. Again, they reemphasize, we're not coming to you. But did you catch what they say in verse 13? In verse 13, they say, you have brought us out of a land of flowing with milk and honey. That description, a land flowing with milk and honey, is a description that has been reserved and saved for a description of the promised land. To talk about how beautiful, how wonderful, how great that land is for them. A land that they have seen, that those 12 spies went out and saw and brought back that produce and said, the land is great, the land is fertile, the land is an awesome land. And you remember they talked about the giants and afraid of it. But they talked about how great that land was. But notice where these guys say. They say they say in verse 14, you haven't took us to that land yet. They said, but you also took us out of a land of milk and honey. Well, where did they come from? They came from Egypt. They had forgotten what Egypt was truly like. Now, we've seen people before in this group raise arguments about saying, go back to Egypt. Egypt's better than this. Egypt's got these great things. And we talked about that, and that seems to be some Egyptians that had gathered with the Israelites that had obeyed with God. They didn't seem to be the Jews that said that, but here we finally see the Israelites themselves start looking at their past, and what they do, they look back, and they look back with what we call rose-colored glasses. Because you remember, when they go to Egypt, they're slaves. They are struggling. They were driven to work harder than they ever had before. But these guys say, oh, that was a land flowing with milk and honey. And I thought about that over and over today as I thought about what they say. And I thought about how true that is sometimes for us. We look at these men and we say, how could they dare think of Egypt being that way? But we sometimes do the same thing ourselves, don't we? Because sometimes we forget where we were. We forget what we were in and how of a bad shape we were. And we sometimes look back at those days, and especially look at our pre-Christian days, and say, oh, remember when we could do this? Remember when our past life was so wonderful because we didn't have to worry about what God said? We didn't have to worry about being faithful. We could do what we wanted to do. Oh, that was a good life. Was that a good life? No. Because that life of us, the past life, is very similar to Egypt, how it was for the Israelites. In Egypt, the Israelites were slaves. In our lives, before we became Christians, we were slaves to sin, Romans 6. Sin was our master. And the payment of that master was death. And we know that. We recognize that. But sometimes we forget it, don't we? Sometimes we forget and we yearn for those days in the past. Well, why? Because we look to the past, and in looking to the past, we also look to the future, the present. And we look at the present now, and we look at the next verse, what they say. They're upset because Moses, they said, you took us out of a great place, but you haven't yet got us to a great place yet. We're not to a land flowing with milk and honey. You failed. And again, us as Christians, sometimes we do that with God, don't we? We look at our life and say, well, God, I had all this before I was a Christian. And now I'm a Christian and I suffer and I have hard times because living the Christian life and just the way this world is, I've not yet reached heaven. Lord, is it worth it? Why did you bring me here? Why did you lead me into this wilderness? And we do just like these men do. Or these men did, excuse me. We glorify the past and we forget our future. You see, as Christians, we've got to remember our past was a past of sin, a past of death, a past of waste, a past that had no value. But once we have given up that slavery of sin and been transferred into the ownership of God, we have a promise of the future, a promise of redemption, of greatness, of a land flowing with milk and honey waiting for us, a beautiful land, if we'll remain faithful, if we'll remain true. Tonight I want to ask you, in your life, do you feel like these men? Do you feel like your past sinful life was a place you ought to be? Do you feel like where you were before, that's where you were your happiest? I guarantee you, if you look at it, you think about it, you weren't. You look at sin and where it leads us and what it does for us, it's not all glory, it's not all pretty. There's consequences, there's suffering. But sometimes in this life, as Christians, it may be hard to continue forward. We've got to remember that God has promised us that land. He's promised us a home with Him if we'll simply remain faithful, if we'll simply keep going forward. That's what the promise was here. You see, the ultimate thing they accused Moses of doing, they say, you've not kept your promise. God's not kept His promise. They forgot all they did wrong. But God hadn't kept His promise. Well, they're going to find out God keeps His promises. God's going to show them how He keeps His promises and how great of a God He is. Us, as Christians, must remember that same truth, that God will keep His promises as long as we remain steadfast, as long as we remain true and faithful to Him. Tonight, I want to ask you, in your life, do you need to have that remembrance? Do you need to remember what your life is going to end in, what the end goal of every Christian is? To enjoy that home of heaven with God. But we only get that by faithfully walking in the light as He is in the light. Tonight, I want to ask you, are you walking that life God has called you to walk? If you're not, we encourage you to change your life so that you are. If you're not a Christian who's never left the slavery of sin, make that decision tonight. Put Him on in that water grave of baptism. Have your sins washed away and rise to walk in newness of life. And as you rise to walk in that new life, there is going to be hardship. There's going to be difficulties. There's going to be struggles. But when that happens, we have to remember we have a promise of the future as long as we keep walking and going forward in the line. As Christians, sometimes we stumble. Sometimes we fall. We need to be picked up. We need to be re-encouraged. It's a great thing about nights like tonight and these invitations. This is a time for us to admit that we need prayer, that we need help. Tonight, if you're struggling, having a hardship, and you're not focused on that home of heaven, we encourage you to get that encouragement. Let us help you. Let us pray with you. Let us talk to you. Tonight, if your life is not being walked in a way that you're constantly headed toward that heavenly home, we encourage you to change it so that it is. And we ask again that if there's anything you need, that you'll come as together we stand and as we sing. Way, Lord, have thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Mold me and make me after thy will, while I am waiting, yielded and still. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. For my being, absolute sway. Will with thy spirit, till all shall see Christ only always living in me.
Shall we pray? Our Father in heaven, we're thankful that you've given us another opportunity to come out and worship you tonight, praying it will be good for us and you get the honor and glory of it. We do thank you for the God-breathed, inspired words you have left us to study and live by, the good news. Praying that we will study that and live faithfully more each day as we go through life. Pray for those that were mentioned on our prayer list. Their health might be restored if that's your will. Pray that be with their families. They might have the comfort they need as well. We do thank you for the congregation here. We pray for each family and each member. Pray for our Bible class teachers. Real thankful for the effort they put out to teach every week. Pray that you bless them. Pray for our deacons. Just pray for all of us. We might grow in faith, love for you. Thank you for the blood of Christ, the church you established for us. That's a great blessing. Help us to always realize that and do those things you have commanded us to do. Thanking you for your peace and your grace. Ask your mercy be upon us. In Christ's name we do pray. Amen.
All right, if you will, get your Bibles and turn with us, if you haven't already, to Numbers chapter 16. Numbers 16 is where we will begin. As I said, we are going to talk about Korah's rebellion tonight. We talked about the two men in our devotional of Dathan and Abiram. Those were two men, but Korah is the one that seems to be the ringleader of the whole group. Matter of fact, every time you see this event referenced in this chapter and also in future books, or future Bible books, it's always listed as Korah that leads the rebellion. And so we're going to look at this idea of Korah and who he was and what he did and what his rebellion was. Again, remember, this comes on the heels of, remember a few weeks ago we studied Numbers 15 about the sacrifices that I told you was sort of an odd break there. But you go back to Numbers 13 and 14, you have the 12 spies and their bad report, their false report, and what it causes the people of Israel to do. Now they're wandering, and it's during this time of wandering that Korah steps up. Now, let's talk about what Korah does. Let's read about what Korah does first, and we'll talk about it. Notice verse 1. Now Korah, the son of Izhar, son of Kohath, of Levi, and Dathan, and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took men. And they rose up before Moses with a number of the people of Israel, 250 chiefs of the congregation, chosen from the assembly, well-known men. They assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron, and said to them, "You have gone too far, for all in the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" When Moses heard it, he fell on his face, and he said to Korah and all of his company, "In the morning the Lord will show who is his and who is holy, and will bring him near to him. The one whom he chooses, he will bring near to him." Now let's stop here and let's talk about this challenge. Notice beginning back in verse 1, you have Korah. And Korah is one of the sons of Levi. He's a Levite. And he falls under the sons of Kohath. That was one of the groups. Now, the interesting thing about Kohath is that some Bible connections can be made in that the family of Kohath is the same family that Moses and Aaron has come from, or the same family that Moses and Aaron came from. There are some, and I forget exactly how they draw the connection, there are some who think that Izhar and Moses and Aaron's father, Amram, were brothers. So there's a possibility that Kohath is a cousin of Moses and Aaron. Either way, we know he's a Levite, and he's one of the ones that's over the charge of moving the tabernacle. He's one of the ones that carries the furniture. He rises up in rebellion, and he gets other men with him. Notice he gets 3 men. Now, here's an interesting thing about this. is when you have this first verse, there are 4 men mentioned as leading this, as head men leading this rebellion. You get down to what we read in verse 12, you only see 2 of these men mentioned again. And then throughout most of this passage, you just read of Korah. And so it's very interesting how these are all grouped together. It doesn't list all these men every time, but they're all grouped together under those names. And so you'll notice that they have Dathan and Abiram and also On. And you'll notice that these men rise up against Moses and Aaron out of jealousy. Because you'll notice they come from the family of who? They're the sons of what? Very last name in that verse. Well, after Peleth. Peleth was the father of On. Reuben. These are sons of Reuben. Now, why would these sons of Reuben rebel against Moses and Aaron? What was Reuben to Jacob? Which son? He was the oldest. He was the first son. So if any tribe should have had the leader come from them, it would have been this tribe. And so we think, and again, we're never told, but it appears to be, and we can make this pretty situated, that Dathan and Abiram and On come because they want to take over the physical leadership of Israel. They're saying that we are the sons of Reuben. We are the tribe of the firstborn. We ought to be the ones in control. We ought to be the ones leading Israel, not you. On the other side, you have Korah, who's coming at this not that wants to lead the physical side of Israel, but he wants to lead the spiritual side. Because remember, he's a Levite, but he's not a priest. Because remember, all priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. It's only those of the descendants of Aaron who are priests. And so Korah tries to rebel against them, and he tries to usurp their power. And so you notice verse 2 is what we see this, that they come before Moses, and you notice they come with 250 of the leading men. They have gathered this following with them. Again, 250 sounds like a huge number, but you got to remember, the nation of Israel is going to be about 2.5 million people at this time. Again, half of that would be men. There's at least 600,000 to 700,000 men, 20 and older. So you're looking at about 600,000 to 700,000 men. 250 of them are with this group. And I say that to say this. This sounds like a large number, but in the overall congregation, this is not that large of a number. But it is a sect that is rising up against Moses. Now, the other thing about this, you'll notice, these are leading men. These are men who were renowned in their community, that they were the heads of their family. And you notice they come against Moses and against Aaron. And notice in verse 3 what they say to them. And they say, "You've gone too far. You're trying to take away too much from us." Notice what they say. They say, "For all the congregation is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them." Then notice, "Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" Now notice they say all of Israel is holy, and the Lord is among Israel. They're right. What they said in those first two statements are true. Israel was holy because they were called to be a holy nation for God. God was in their midst. The problem is the third statement. When they say, "You made yourselves over the assembly. You exalted yourselves above the assembly." When we look at the story of Exodus, we see that nowhere does Moses want leadership. Matter of fact, if you remember the burning bush, God has to argue with Moses to go free the people. How many times does Moses say, "God, give it to Aaron. Give it to somebody else. I don't want it." But these men come and accuse Moses. "Moses, you took over the leadership. You took this upon yourself." But we know the story is no, it's God gave this to Moses. And because of this, they come and they question Moses. But notice verse 4. When Moses heard it, he fell on his face. Moses falls down before them. He falls down. This is a very similar incident back in chapter 13. Remember the people grumbled against God, that Moses and Aaron fell on their face. And this is not the first time and the only time we're going to see Moses and Aaron do this move. They fall down on their face sort of in shock. And knowing that this is, the other idea about this is they're falling down before God in doing this too. They're going prostrate, trying to get favor from God, because what's happening here is the same thing that happened in chapter 13 and 14. They know these people are rebelling not against Moses and Aaron, but they're rebelling against God. And so Moses falls down on his face. And verse 5 is a very interesting situation, because Moses speaks. Now, again, the question is, does Moses speak when he's on the ground, or does he get up? Does time pass? We're really not sure about how this breaks down in the next verse. But Moses seems to fall down before all the people. The crowd sort of disperses, because now Moses speaks to only one man. And you notice he's going to speak to one man, Korah, in verses 4 through verse 11. What we read earlier, or to get to verse 12 we read earlier. You remember in verse 12, Moses calls Eliab, or Dathan, and Avram to come to him, meaning that Dathan and Avram have left. They're not at this meeting. So this is, again, this is another thing where the Bible doesn't tell us every little detail. It gives us general ideas, a general summation of the story. Again, if it was, again, a modern-day book, we would expect this to be telling us exactly about the people stood here for this long, and these people left, and these people stayed, and then Moses did this, and Moses spoke this way. The Bible doesn't always do that. It just gives us the important details. It doesn't give it all the miniature and minute details that we may want to have. But Moses speaks to Korah, and notice what he says in verse 5. He speaks to Korah and all of his company. Now, Korah's company is not the company of the other men, because they've left. This is Korah and the Levites. There are a group of Levites who have aligned themselves with Korah. And we're going to find out there's 250 Levites who have aligned themselves with Korah and with his rebellion. And so he speaks to Korah, and notice what he says. In the morning, he says, tomorrow, God will show us who is his. God will show who really is his leadership, who really is his spiritual leadership. And notice it says he will show who is holy and will bring him near to him. The one whom he chooses, he will bring near to him. So Moses is about to lay down a challenge, a duel, if you will. What's going to happen here is very similar to Mount Carmel. And you remember Mount Carmel with Isaiah when he challenges the prophets of Baal to a duel to see which God comes first? This is what Moses is going to do. Moses is going to say, look, Korah, you take your men, Aaron on this side, and we're going to see who God chooses. And God's going to make known who he chooses. And this is what he's going to say. And he says, here's the challenge. Verse 6, do this. Take censers, Korah and all of his company, put fire in them and put incense on them before the Lord tomorrow. And the man whom the Lord chooses shall be the Holy One. You have gone too far, sons of Levi. So here's what he says. You're going to take a censer. Now these censers were a pan with a long handle. They were bronze pans that were used in service to God. You would put this coal on them, and you would put the incense on top of the coals, and the incense would burn, and it would be a pleasing aroma to God. And so what Moses says is, Korah, you and your 250 men, you're going to get your incense, your censers, your pans with these coals and with this incense, and you're going to stand over here. Aaron's going to get his pan, his incense, his coal, and he's going to go over here. Now, again, the idea is that they're all going to use the incense that was from God. Remember, God gave a recipe for how to make incense. They're all going to use the incense that is right, that was commanded by God, because the priest, that was part of the Levite's job, was to make that. And so he says, we're all going to offer this incense. We're going to see who God chooses. And notice again where he ends this, it's sort of interesting. In verse 3, Korah and Dathan and Avram accuse Moses of going too far. Now Moses says, no, you've gone too far. You have gone too far in that you have usurped the authority of God. And now he goes on in verse 8. And Moses said to Korah, hear now, you sons of Levi, is it too small a thing for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the congregation of Israel, to bring you near to himself, to do service in the tabernacle of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation to minister to them? and that he has brought you near him, and all your brothers, the sons of Levi, with you. And you would seek the priesthood also? Therefore, it is against the Lord that you and all your company have gathered together. What is Aaron that you grumble against him? Now here we get to the heart of the matter. Moses begins to speak to the Levites, and he says, now listen. He says, what more do you expect? Is basically what he's saying. He says, is it not too small for you to see what God has done for you? To see that God has separated you from the entire nation? God has taken the tribe of Levi and said, they're my people, they're my servants. Again, these Levites were not priests, but they were dedicated to God's servant. And notice what he says, that God has separated you from the congregation, that he could bring you near to himself, that you could do service in the tabernacle, and you can stand before the congregation to minister to them. And again, he says that God has done this, that he can bring you near to him. He says, this is what God has done for you, but you're not happy with it? You want more? And he gets to the end of that, what they're looking for in verse 10, because he says, and you also seek the what? The priesthood. Meaning, what did Korah want? Korah wanted to be a priest. From the idea here, and going to what Moses said earlier, Korah wants Aaron's spot. He doesn't just want to be priest, he wants to be the high priest. Okay, if you notice earlier, Moses says God will show who the Holy One is. Not the Holy Ones, the Holy One. Korah wants this high priest spot. And Moses says he's using you in his war. He's using you in his rebellion. Don't you know better? And in verse 11, we get to the gist of the matter, the heart of the matter, if you will, where he says, therefore it is against the Lord that you and all your company have gathered together. What is Aaron that you grumble against him? He said, Aaron is just a man like you. Moses is just a man like you that God has chosen. Aaron doesn't have any special ability in himself. There's nothing special, unique, amazing about Aaron. It's simply because God chose him. God's the one that gave Aaron this ability. God's the one that put Aaron in a spot. Therefore, he says, Aaron is not the one you've went against. Moses is not the one you've went against. You've went against God. And therefore, you've got to stand and see who God chooses. And then we get to verse 12. Now, before we get to verse 12, any question or comment about Korah and Moses' challenge? All right, verse 12. We already read this, so again, we're not going to go in detail. You notice again, Moses sent to Dathan and Abiram to come to him. They refused. And again, they have those rose-colored glasses. They said Egypt was a land flowing with milk and honey. There's one other thing I want you to notice about what they say here over and over again. That they have this accusory tone of Moses of what you have done. Notice what they say in verse 13 and 14 again. Is it a small thing that you have brought us up out of the land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness? That you must also make yourself a prince over us. Moreover, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, nor given us inheritance of fields and vineyard. Will you put out the eyes of these men? We will not come up. You see what they're doing? They're accusing Moses. They say, Moses, you led us out of Egypt. You brought us to the wilderness. You didn't get us into Canaan. Moses, this is your fault. You have failed as a leader. Now again, they forget what they did. Because these are the same men who just a short time before listened to this 10 bad spies instead of 2 good spies. They are the ones who are forced to wander in the wilderness. They're the ones who have cost themselves lives in the promised land because of their unfaithfulness. But they can't accept that. They have to lay it at Moses' feet. And they say, Moses, you did this to us. You made yourself a prince or a ruler. That word prince can also be ruler over us. And then they notice he says the last part, he says, will you put out the eyes of these men? Basically, he says, will you punish these men? Because we speak against you, are you going to punish us? Are you going to take this into your own hand? We're going to see later in this chapter, Moses is going to show them it's not me that's going to punish you, it's God. And God's going to punish them in a very unique way. And then you notice they again say, we will not come up. And then you get to verse 15. Verse 15 is very interesting. It's where Johnny finished reading for us. Because it describes Moses in a state that we have never seen him before in. We have seen Moses angry a few times. When he come off the mountain with the golden calf, he was angry. When there's a few other places it says Moses was angry. This is the only place where it says Moses was very angry. Moses is what we would say fit to be tied. Because these guys ought to know better. These are the leaders of Israel. And they're acting this way. And you notice Moses goes to God and he tells God, don't respect their offering. Don't listen to them, God. They're not faithful. And then you notice Moses says, I have not taken one donkey from them. He says, I haven't taken a thing off of them. They haven't given me anything. I have, what he's saying is, the next part, I have not harmed them. I've done nothing wrong to them, God. I've done nothing wrong. Don't hear them. Don't respect them. Don't listen to them. Now again, Moses doesn't know where God stands on this issue because God's not spoke to Moses yet. And Moses here, and again, we can understand this because Moses is human. When people question us, in your job, no matter what you're at, if people question you, no matter how much you think, no, I've not done anything to be questioned, it still causes a little doubt in your mind, don't it? To stop and say, well, why did they question me? Why did they bring this up? This is what we see in Moses here, I believe. Moses goes to God and says, God, I've not done anything. Don't listen to them. Don't respect their offering. And then you notice verse 16. Moses goes back to Korah again. Notice this flip-flop. Moses spoke to Korah. Moses called Dathan and Abiram. And now he goes back to Korah. He goes to Korah, be present, you and your companion, you and your company before the Lord, you and they and Aaron tomorrow. Let every one of you take his censer and put incense on it, and every one of you bring before the Lord his censer, 250 censers, you also, and Aaron and his censer. So every man took his censer and put fire in them and laid incense on them, and stood at the entrance to the tent of meeting with Moses and Aaron. Then Korah assembled all the congregation against them at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation. So notice this. Moses says, okay, Aaron's going to be here, you and your men over here, and we're going to have a duel to see which one God chooses. Well, Korah goes a step further than this, because in verse 19, Korah tells the whole nation of Israel, hey, look, we're going to gather in front of the tabernacle. We're going to see whose God's chosen people is. You're going to see that Moses is not the man he claims to be. That Aaron is not the holy man he claims to be. He calls Moses out, and so he gathers all the congregation together. And as they're gathered together, the glory of the Lord appeared. Imagine this. The whole congregation is gathered together to see this showdown between Aaron and these Levites. And a cloud descends on the tabernacle. And notice this next part. This is a reassurance to Moses. Because notice verse 20. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron. Doesn't speak to Korah. Doesn't speak to Abiram. Doesn't speak to Dathan. Doesn't speak to the whole congregation. He speaks to his chosen people. His two leaders. And God finally says something. Notice what God says, verse 21. Separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment. Verse 22, and they fell on their faces and said, O God, the God of spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin, and will you be angry with all the congregation? And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Say to the congregation, get away from the dwellings of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. So let's stop right there and see what happens. God comes down, God speaks to Moses and Aaron, and God says, get away from them. Let's blast them all out. I'm going to wipe the whole group out again. It's about the third time God said, I'm going to wipe out Israel. And I'm going to get rid of them. And Moses and Aaron, notice again, I told you in verse 4, remember when they charged Moses being unfaithful, what does Moses do? He fell on his face. As soon as God says this to Moses and Aaron, what do? They fall on their face before God. And they cry out to God and they call God, God, remember who you are. And they say, don't kill everybody because of one man's sin. Now again, you go back to verse 1, there were 4 men that led this rebellion. But I told you over and over again, there's one main man who this rebellion is laid at his feet. It's Korah. They're calling Korah out and say, God, it's not everybody, it's Korah. Korah is the one that ought to suffer. And then he knows verse 23, God speaks to Moses here, and he says, okay, you tell everybody to get away from the camp, get away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Aviram. And he's going to do this because he's about to do something. Now, this is a very interesting part of the story. God tells Moses to tell that the end. We're going to see in the next verse, God actually told Moses more than what we just heard there. Because Moses is about to tell us what God told him. Notice, continue in verse 25. Then Moses rose and went to Dathan and Abiram, and the elders of Israel followed him. And he spoke to the congregation, saying, depart, please, from the tents of those wicked men, and touch nothing of their tents, lest you be swept away with all their sins. So they got away from the dwelling of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And Dathan and Abiram came out and stood at the door of their tents, together with their wives, their sons, and their little ones. Now, let's stop right here before we get to Moses' statement. Now, you'll notice these 3 are grouped together, of Dathan, Abiram, and Korah's tents. There's one other thing that's an interesting idea, is that the tribe of Reuben camped on the south side of the tabernacle. The Kohath Levites, the Levites from the family of Kohath, they camped on the south side of the tabernacle. So there's a very good case that Kohath lives near Dathan and Abiram. So this is a conspiracy that they have been building probably for a while. These 3 men are connected. And so you notice Moses gets the word from God to go to their tents. And notice that Moses goes to those tents. And notice what happens at the end of verse 25. This is what I told you earlier. The 250 sounds like a big number, but it was a minority. Because the elders do what? Who do they follow? They follow Moses. Not they followed other people. They followed Moses out of this place. And then you notice that Moses spoke to the congregation. He says, get away from the tents of these men. Don't touch anything. Don't get near them, lest you suffer with them. And then verse 27 tells me another thing, that these men were the minority. Because verse 27 says the people did what? They got away. They moved. Why? They respected Moses. The people did not question Moses' leadership here. They were not in this rebellion. They believed Moses. Moses says, get away from the tent. These people moved. How do I know that? You notice the end of that verse? That when they tell the people to move away, to get away from the tents of Korah, Dathan and Abiram, that Dathan and Abiram are in their tent. They're not out the meeting. They're not watching the showdown. And when Moses tells everybody to get away from the tent, what these men do, they come and they stand in the entranceway of their tent. Again, their tent probably would have had a flap that covered the door, sort of like a porch. It's sort of that idea of today in our setting of going to someone's house to calling them out, and they come out on the front porch and almost dare you, like, what are you doing here? What are you doing on my place? Why are you infringing on me? They come out with these men, their wives, their children, and their little ones. They're all gathered there together. They all stand together in rebellion against God and his leaders. And then we get to verse 28. And Moses said, hereby you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these works, and that it has not been of my own accord. If these men die as all men die, or if they are visited by the fate of all mankind, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates something new, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into Sheol, then you shall know that these men have despised the Lord. So notice what Moses says here. Moses says here again, he basically institutes another challenge. He tells the people of Israel, they've gathered around. He says, okay, and the elders, remember the elders are with him? He says, here's proof of whether or not God's with me or with them. He says, if these men die, as all other men die, what does he mean there? If they die of old age. If they live past this day, is what he's saying, then God is not with me. God has not sent me. God is not my God. I'm not his servant. I'm not his prophet. And this is something else we see many times prophets doing. Prophets say, you question me? What they tell prophets true or not is whether or not his words come true. Moses says, if these men die of old age, then I'm not a real prophet. I'm not the real leader of God's people. But, verse 30, but if God creates something new, if God destroys them in a way that people have never been destroyed before, and he even goes on to it and says, the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up, and all that belongs to them, and they go down into Sheol, you will know that these men have despised the Lord. He says, but here's what's going to happen. To show you that I am from God, the ground's going to swallow them up. The ground's going to open, swallow them, and the image is it's going to close back over them. It's not like a natural disaster of an earthquake or something that just creates a hole, like a sinkhole, but it's going to close them back up. And you notice he's going to say, and he says here, that they shall go down alive into Sheol. The Sheol is the word for death, the Hadean realm where the dead spirits are. He says they're going to die. They're going to be swallowed alive, and the ground's going to swallow them, and it's going to cover them up. And then notice verse 31. We can't stop there tonight. Verse 31. And as soon as he has finished speaking all these words, the ground under them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their households and all the people who belonged to Korah and all their goods. And so they and all that belonged to them went down alive into Sheol, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. And all of Israel who were around them fled at their cry, for they said, lest the earth swallow us up. Notice, but as soon as Moses finishes speaking, he says, if God doesn't do something today, no, God's going to do something that very instant. As soon as Moses says, let God show who his chosen man is, God acts. The earth opens. And you got to imagine just what kind of image this was. That the earth opens and these men, not just the men fall, but their wives, their children, all that belongs to them, all their tents, all their belongings is swallowed up. It goes down in this hole. And then to see just this miraculous part of this is it's not, again, like I said, it's not like a sinkhole opens and they just go down on the ground and they're down in a hole. But you notice in verse 33, and the verse 33 in the middle of that, it says, and the earth closed upon them. They fell down into a hole, and that hole filled itself back up. Yeah, he buried them. He took care of them. And again, that's sort of the image. He buries them alive. And again, this is that idea that they went alive down to Sheol. They went alive down to death. Now, you usually don't go to Sheol till you die. But these men were condemned in that they were alive when the earth buried them up. And the interesting thing to me about this, the funny thing to me, is verse 34. Remember, he's already told them, get away from the tents. And everybody got away from the tents. This event happens. And again, notice something here in this. Let me, before I go to this last part. Notice, it didn't just swallow up the tents of Dathan and Abiram. It also swallowed up Korah's tent. Now, Korah's not there. Korah's in the tabernacle. And just real quickly, you may say, well, why is Korah not here? Well, Korah has started or got involved in a holy service to God. Once you begin your holy service, you cannot leave that tabernacle complex till that service is done. So Korah has no clue of what's happened out here. Now his tent is gone. The tents of Abiram and Dathan are gone. And then we get to verse 34, and this is where I told you it's sort of interesting to me. that all of Israel who's there watching this, they see the earth swallow them up, and they all back up even further. Because why? Catch this. They fled at their cry. They heard their screams. They heard their cry out as they were swallowed by the earth. And they all backed up and said, lest we be consumed too. Lest we suffer the same fate. I'm not getting close to this. I'm not worrying about this. And then in this same instant, we're going to see next week, we're going to finish this chapter in verse 35, that the 250 men with Korah and the Aaron in the tabernacle complex, God has the earth swallow these men. And again, in that same instant, that same time period, fire's going to come. And it's going to destroy the men of Korah. And it's going to leave Aaron standing by himself. What this does is this cements in Israel's mind that the leaders are Moses and Aaron. And to rebel against them is to rebel against God. And God will not stand rebellion. Rebellion has to be punished. It has to be brought down. That's what we're going to see next week when we pick this back up. Any question or comment about verse 34 or up to verse 34? Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Is that nation? Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. And again, you see Moses' dedication to the people, that he's in dedication to God, that he doesn't want to disrupt that plan and change that. Mm-hmm. Yep, he did. He trusted God, and again, that is the interesting thing about this, to see Moses' disposition in all this. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, they quit. They quit trusting in that promise and quit trusting in God. Period. And they forget Him. And again, and I'll say this, and we'll be done. Like I said in devotional, we sometimes look and says, how dare they forget this? But we do the same thing. You know, we forget what God did for us. We take that for granted. But we've got to watch ourselves, because we can rebel against God just as easily as these men did. All right, again, appreciate everybody being here. Appreciate your attention. Next week we'll pick up and we'll see what happens to Korah and his men and what the final consequences of that is. But for tonight, we're going to stop right there. Again, appreciate everybody being here, and we'll see you all Sunday morning, Lord willing. Thank you.